150 events. In our last webinars, we've covered topics like how to write resumes, the best practices for writing a cover letter in order to obtain an interview, and how to construct an elevator pitch. Today we're going to move forward to the next step, and we'll cover the particulars of how to ace a phone interview. My name is Liz Wheeler. I am the social media manager here at Recruit Military. Joining me today for this webinar is Mike Frankum, former Army captain and Senior Vice President of Marketing here at Recruit Military. Mike has worked in the field of veteran hiring for many years and brings an incredible wealth of knowledge regarding how to transition from the military to the civilian world and how to find a job in that process. At the end of this webinar, we will be hosting a live question and answer session, so be sure to stick around for that. If you have any technical difficulties with the GoToWebinar program during this webinar, please let me know. Use that same chat box attached to the toolbar on the right-hand side of the page. If you have any other questions or comments during the course of the presentation, feel free to use that chat box as well. I will try to answer questions throughout the webinar as best I can. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to Mike Frankum and begin how to ace a phone interview. Mike?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Liz. And before I jump into things, just to give a quick little background for everyone on what I'm drawing the material from for today. Since 1998, I've been involved in the veteran recruiting industry, and in that time, I've worked with hundreds of companies and hundreds of individual veterans in their transition. I don't do a lot of that in my current role anymore, but what I'm drawing on are literally the experiences of assisting hundreds of veterans in preparing for successful phone interviews. And the reason that a phone interview is such an important topic is because it is so prevalent in the job search process today. And so you really have to understand what it is, how to navigate it, and how to prepare for it, and what your expectations should really be. So with that, a phone interview is used today by recruiters and hiring managers as a first screening step in most cases. Most of the time, unless it's a smaller company that is maybe 3 miles from your house, you're likely to have a phone interview before you get a in-person interview with a company. And oftentimes I'm asked, why do they do this? I'd rather go in person. We all would. But the reason that companies do this are twofold. One, it's less expensive and more efficient for the interviewer to do things over the telephone in that first phase. And secondly, if you think about the way business is done today, a lot of it is done over the telephone, and that's whether it doesn't matter whether you're in a sales position, an operations position, whatever it might be, you're likely going to be communicating over the telephone. And so this tactic of having a phone interview is also part of the evaluation process to see what kind of communication skills do you as an individual have while you are talking with people over the telephone. And then the last important point for you to remember in a phone interview is what's your goal, or what is it that you want to achieve out of a phone interview, and that is to obtain a face-to-face interview. You want to get to the next step, period. That's what you're trying to accomplish in a phone interview. And so if you get that to happen after having that phone conversation, you've successfully navigated and achieved success with a phone interview. So when you think of a phone interview, Liz, if you go to the next slide, there's 3 components really to think about. And the first, and no magic words here or anything, it's really just you've got what do you need to do before a phone interview, and what you need to focus on there is the preparation. You need to be prepared going into a phone interview, and I'm going to talk on specific points on that here in a moment. Then you need to actually execute on what happens during the interview. And the key word I want you to take out of the during phase is that it's just as important and probably more important for you to listen on that phone interview and do that first than it is on what you let out of your mouth when you're giving your answer, because you want to make sure that what you actually deliver meets what they are asking and what are the needs of the company. And that's why that listening is so important. And then obviously you want to be professional in your delivery on the telephone. And then there's the after phase component of the interview, and that's your follow-up. And we'll touch on a few points there on giving you some guidelines to think about in your follow-up after you have a phone call. Well, let's take a look at first what are we talking about when we're talking about that preparation. And Liz, if you go to the next slide, one of the first things I want to emphasize is that always schedule the interview. And sometimes when you get a phone call from a recruiter, you might be so excited that you got a bite on your resume or an application that the recruiter might approach that phone call and say, "Hi, Mike, this is Tom with ABC Company. And do you have a few moments to talk? I'd like to, I'm looking at your resume and I'd like to talk with you about your background." I really encourage you at that point to have a little bit of courage and professionalism and say to that recruiter, "Tom, I really appreciate the phone call. I'm real excited about the opportunity with ABC Company. I'm not in a great location right now. Can we schedule a time for us to talk so that I can make sure that I'm in a location where we're not going to be disrupted?" That's perfectly fine, and I really encourage you to take that step. Don't get caught off guard and kind of spouting off the cuff, because the phone interview is too critical for you to get to the next step, and you want to do the rest of the steps that I'm going to touch on here to be prepared. And also, you actually will come across as a more professional person by pausing and saying, "I'd like to really be in a place where I can focus on you, Mr. Interviewer, and be able to have a great conversation." So that's real important when you're thinking about a phone interview. Next is make sure you prepare your resume and print a copy to have in front of you. And you want that resume to be the same version that the interviewer has. So make sure that you try to understand, if you don't know how the interviewer got your resume, what version of your resume they may have, so that you can be sure that you're working off the same resume. And what I encourage you to do is to make sure you know what position you're being interviewed for, and then go through your resume and with a highlighter or a different colored pen or something to that effect, highlight those things that are most relevant to the position you're going to be talking about or the company you're going to be talking with in that phone interview. That way, you're creating some talking points and some highlights that you want to make sure you hit in that conversation, because they're most relevant to the position that you know you're interviewing for. So that's what we mean by prepare your resume, is really prepare that as a resource for you, because you can have that right in front of you in your conversation and reference that while you're talking on the phone. Next.
Mike,
yeah.
If I may interject for just a second, it looks like we're getting some questions about resume writing, and they're all great questions. I do encourage you to visit our YouTube channel. We have an entire webinar dedicated just to how to write a resume effectively. I'll include the link to that webinar in the follow-up email that you'll receive following this webinar. But for those of you who'd like to jot it down right now, it's rmvets.com/resume-writing-101. And like I said, I'll include that URL in the follow-up email, and we have a whole webinar dedicated just to the topic of how to prepare your resume effectively. Mike?
All right, thanks, Liz. Great points. And we will have a question and answer period at the end of this too. So keep those questions coming throughout, and we'll cover as many as we can when we're done with our material on the phone interview. Next thing we really encourage you is to be prepared with your 30-second elevator pitch. And just like the resume writing, we've got a webinar on the elevator pitch that you can find on our YouTube channel. But and this is where that listening comes into effect, is when you get on the phone with the interviewer, they're going to set the stage for you, tell you a little bit about the company and the opportunity. And if they don't, I encourage you to ask the questions right up front to clarify that you know what you're interviewing for, and then they're probably going to ask you about yourself. And that's where you want to be ready with your 30-second elevator pitch that introduces you and brings out your experience that matches the company. So don't be just generic here. This is your opportunity to shine. You'll have had an opportunity to think about the position, research the company a little bit, and have an answer ready to go that matches what the company's looking for. Liz, if you could go to the next slide, please. As you get ready for the interview, really encourage you to practice. And by practicing, I really encourage you, if you haven't done many phone interviews, find a friend or family member that you can give 3 to 5 questions to that are likely questions for you to get. The tell me about yourself question, what are your strengths, what are some things you need to work on. General questions like that would be great ones to just practice with some family members. And remember that in a phone interview, one of the things that's missing is the benefit of nonverbal cues in a phone conversation. So that means that oftentimes when you're the interviewer and you're sitting across from someone over a desk or a table, you can see in the eyes their excitement. You can tell by the way they carry themselves that they're super excited to be there. But on the phone, they can't see your eyes. They can't see your posture. They can't see that you're dressed to the nines and how professional you look. So you really have to come across that way. And the way that you do that is by this practice on what and how you're going to say. And you don't want it to come across that you're reading a script. You want it to just be natural. That you want this to be a conversation between you and the other person. And in that conversation, you want to convey confidence, high energy, optimism, and warmth. And I use these kind of touchy-feely words because what's happening as you're being introduced in this phone interview is people are beginning to think about you in their organization, and they're saying, do I like the sound of this person, and can I see myself working with them, and would I potentially enjoy working with them? And if you don't give that impression, then it's going to be hard to overcome and get to the next step, even if you've got all the right technical skills maybe. Most people at this phase are probably thinking or have emotions coming into it, and they want to feel good about you in the conversation that they're having. So think about that. And then I mentioned in the warmth there to smile while on the phone. One thing that's amazing is that you can tell when someone is smiling and they're talking to you on the phone, and that always comes across better when you're the interviewer, and it's a more pleasant conversation, and you enjoy the conversation more. And I will say, having interviewed hundreds of people, that I spend more time with people who are smiling on the other end of the phone than I do with those who aren't smiling. And I literally can tell. Why? Because I just enjoy talking to them more, and I'm more inclined to give them time because they're probably exuding a greater amount of energy, and I need that energy on my team, or my client needs that on their team, and that's what I'm thinking as a recruiter. So if you need to, if you're like myself and you come from Eastern European heritage, where being super outgoing and extroverted and super happy is not natural for you, I personally did this when I many years ago was doing phone interviews. I put a mirror in front of me. I used my wife's makeup mirror, put it in front of me, and forced myself to smile as I was talking. And I'm telling you, it makes a big difference. So depending on your personality and how you generally communicate with people, take that step, and it really will go a long way for you. And Liz, why don't you touch on how important it is for you in this preparation phase to do some research, both about the company and who you're talking with.
Sure, and I also want to add one point to your overview on bearing and smiling. And that is, it's not only significant for the person doing the interview to have you smile at them, it also helps you, the person being interviewed, to feel more comfortable. A smile relaxes you, it gives you more confidence in yourself, and it'll help you get rid of the nerves of speaking on the phone to someone that you don't know in a more pressured situation. So it's beneficial on both ends to do that, which is helpful to remember at the beginning of those phone interviews when you're just waiting for the nerves to go away. But as Mike said, it's also very important to research beforehand. This can actually be a very critical part of a phone interview. And it speaks to the point Mike made earlier about if an interviewer calls you and asks you if you have a moment, to then take a moment and reschedule so that you're fully prepared. Because some of the most important weapon in your arsenal is knowledge about who is interviewing you, about the company that you want to work for, about their culture, and about the position themselves, about the position itself. It's really important to understand the position and how it works within that company. And I know it's not possible to know the details about every day-to-day activity that will come with the job, but reviewing what the company is like, whether it's via their website, whether it's via their LinkedIn profile, whether it's via their social media outlets, you can get an idea of the culture of the company so that you can frame your experience to better fit in with them. And also, it's very important, read the job description very thoroughly, know what they're looking for. With their position that they post, they'll post a list of characteristics that they're looking for. Let that allow you to paint a picture of what you think the position is so that you can speak to them on their own terms. You can speak to what they're looking for and illustrate to them how you would best fit in, not only to the technical aspects of their job, but to the company culture as well. It's also a very useful resource to visit the LinkedIn pages of those interviewing you. Just getting an idea of their background, of their experience, of who they are professionally, and even a little bit personally regarding interests they might have posted on LinkedIn or other industries that they might have worked in, makes it a lot easier and less intimidating for you to talk to them on the phone. It humanizes them. It gives you an idea of where they're coming from, of their frame of reference, and of what they're looking for when they speak to you. So make sure that you thoroughly do your research. Don't spend 5 minutes prior to the interview Googling them. Spend a significant amount of time if the position is important to you, and research all you can. Find out all you can about the position, the company, and the interviewer themselves, and it will give you a significant advantage during a phone interview. Mike?
Thanks, Liz. And now we're going to move into the during the interview component of a phone interview. But before I jump in there, hopefully you pick up on that we spent a fair amount of time there on preparation and what happens prior to that phone interview. So hopefully you take away from that the importance of that, because it really does set up what happens during the interview and actually makes the during the interview part of the process the easy part, because you'll have prepared, and now think of it as just a conversation. That's what you're having now, is a conversation with another person. And if you think of it in that way, it helps take out some of those jitters and things like that as well, and makes you feel more comfortable. But during the interview, a few things to think about. One is to be in a comfortable setting that's not going to have distractions. One thing you want to make sure is not to have a lot of background noise. So if you have perhaps a noisy dog at home, lock the dog up, or lock yourself in a room where the dog barking can't reach you. Make sure that if you're not conducting the call over your cell phone, that you turn off your cell phone so that you don't have beeps and whistles and rings happening while you're on the phone with the other person. Try to use a home office or quiet bedroom, whatever that space might be, where you're not going to be distracted. If you have young kids at home, lock the door. If you can't lock the door, put a chair under it so they can't barge in on you. And just keep it professional. And also, by doing that, you're going to be able to focus on the conversation, and you're going to be able to listen and get, because in the listening part, you're also getting all of the clues of the information that you're going to need to succeed in the in-person interviews as well. And then also really try not to interview in obviously public place, such as, Starbucks, and really don't try to do a phone interview if it's a real phone interview while you're driving. Now, I have encouraged veterans I've worked with in the past that if they really don't have a quiet place, then conduct the phone interview in their parked car. And then, because you can shut the windows, turn on the air conditioning, and have a good conversation if that's the only quiet place you can think of to get to. But just don't do it while you're driving, because again, you're not going to be able to concentrate, and you're not going to be able to take notes, because the other thing that you're going to want to do while you are having this interview, and why it's important to be in that comfortable setting, is you want to be able to take notes that you can use, again, to be prepared for that next step in the interview process. Next, you want to be professional. Everything you do comes through the phone, so you want to, as Liz was alluding to earlier, part of this is you want to be feeling good about yourself too. And we know that if we're sitting up straight in a chair or even standing, I personally always, because I mentioned I'm not a natural smiley kind of person, not naturally one to get overly pumped up and outwardly excited, even if on the inside I am. So to come across the right way in phone interviews, I always stood up and I kind of walked around a little bit in the room that I was in while I was conducting the interview. But I kept my pen handy and my notepad right there so I could jot notes as good points came up. And really encourage you to dress professionally, because if you dress well, you generally feel well about yourself. And if you're sitting around in your pajamas, you might be feeling a little bit slovenly and a little bit less energetic than you should on a phone interview. So help yourself feel good and dress professionally. It doesn't mean you have to put on your suit and tie, but I'd encourage you to at least have, a pair of khakis and a button shirt so that you're feeling like you are actually doing something that's professional, because you really are. And again, want to emphasize to have that smile on your face while you're talking on the phone. You go the next slide, please, Liz. And what we want to also do is think about just some basics of communication and some courtesies. Often get asked questions about how do we address the folks that we're going to be interviewing. And I always say use their name in the form in which they introduce themselves. So for instance, if in the phone call that you got from the recruiter to set up the phone interview, they refer to themselves as John Adams, then refer to that individual as John by his first name in the interview. If you, in the introduction, the individual says, hello Mike, this is Mr. Smith at ABC Company, then when you're in the phone interview, refer to that individual as Mr. Smith. That's not going to happen a lot, but occasionally in some cultures, you will get the more formal approach, and so you should go with that culture when you're in that interview, and wait for the individual to say, hey Mike, don't worry about calling me Mr. Smith, my name's Bob. Great, Bob, nice, thanks for letting me know that, is kind of how you would work through that. Again, listen first to what they're doing. They'll set that stage for you, and don't interrupt them. When they're speaking, they're giving you important information, and they're really giving you the clues that you need as the interviewee to answer their questions effectively. And also make sure that you are, because it's a conversation, that you are prepared to ask questions, not just at the end, but also as they may come up throughout the interview. This would seem obvious, but don't eat or drink during the interview. You'll be amazed at what I've heard over the years. I've heard everything from definitely chewing on corn chips to chomping on gum, and you can hear that loud as can be when you're on the other end of the phone. And it's very distracting, and it's really a put-off when you're the one interviewing. So just don't do that. If you get, if your mouth is kind of dry, Certainly you can have a little glass of water to take a sip, but don't sit there and guzzle it. Just take sips, almost so that it's imperceptible to the person that you're doing that. Make sure you speak slowly and clearly when you're answering questions. Avoid using slang, and definitely don't curse doing a phone interview. Again, some of this may sound obvious to you, but I'm saying it because I've had it happen where I've prepared candidates for phone interviews, and they've gone and done some crazy things that I get the feedback then from the company, Mike, you're not going to believe what they did this time. And so all of this may sound very basic, but you really want to remember it and make sure that you follow through on it. And if you're the one that's supposed to call someone else for the phone interview, and you may run into that scenario because they may even sometimes have you on a speakerphone where there will be 2 or 3 people in the room, and you'll be talking to 2 or 3 people. Make sure that if they gave you a time that you call on time. You know, don't be late. Sort of just like showing up to an in-person interview, don't be late. Same thing on the phone, be on time. And then the last part during the interview is close the interview. And by that, really saying if you want the job or you're interested in learning about the job more and going to the next step, make sure you express that and express the desire to go to the next step. So it might sound like, Bob, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I can picture myself in the role that we've been talking about, and I'm excited to go to the next step as soon as you're ready. You're letting them know what that is, and you're doing that in a very professional way on what you want to have happen. If you're not really interested in the job after what you've heard, don't burn a bridge and just say, I'm done. Professionally thank them for the time. And it's going to be just a subtle difference, and it may just be, Bob, I've really enjoyed our conversation today, and I thank you for the time that you've given me to talk about my experiences and how they might fit here at ABC Company. You're not asking to go to the next step, but you're being very professional, and they may still call you back with that closing, and then you've got a decision to make on whether you want to do that or not. But you want to specifically ask for what you want in that next step if you really want that job or position. Liz, can you go to the next slide? Is we want to touch on what happens after the interview. First, you do want to send a thank you note. And don't miss this step, folks, because it really does leave you as an interviewer questioning whether the person that you spoke with is really interested in your company and that position or not. You're just left wondering. And most companies are not only interviewing one person. So if they were doing a phone interview with 5 to 10 people, and generally that's probably about a number that companies are going to do a phone interview with. They're going to phone interview 5 to 10 people to get down to 3 that they can bring in person. Well, if you're one of the 7 people that they did phone interviews with, and you're one of 4 that didn't send a thank you note, there's a good chance that you're going to be one of the 4 that don't get invited back in. Email is acceptable after a phone interview. Make sure, though, that that email is no longer than what can appear on a computer screen, so don't make it War and Peace. Make the letter to be specific to the company and not just generic. And you want to send it on the same day, but not literally immediately after. You know, give it an hour or 2 to give it some reflection, too. You want to reflect on what you heard in that interview so that you can give a thoughtful thank you note. And doing it, you know, a couple of hours after the phone interview is perfectly acceptable, and it also shows some thoughtfulness on your part. And in your content, you want to confirm the interest that you have in the company, your ability to do the job, perhaps with a reminder of an example that you brought up in the phone interview, and your desire to take things to the next step. If you do those 3 basic things in the content of that follow-up email, you'll be in good shape. And then in your follow-up, after you send that thank you note, do that 3 times at the most. Send another note a week after the interview. If you still don't hear anything, do it 2 weeks after the interview. And then last one, 3 weeks after the interview, with a final note in there about, hey, I've got continued interest in your role, Tom, but I'm no longer going to, bother you. I really did appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I do hope to hear from you again. And have that be the general tone and message that you deliver if you reach that 3-week point. But at that point, if you don't hear from them, the reality is they probably moved on to someone else. And though you would like to hear that officially, the reality of the recruiting world is you're not always going to, unfortunately, and it's time for you to just move on because you want to move on to the next opportunity and not be thinking about something that isn't going to come to fruition. So Liz, with that, if you could recap, and we'll then move into the questions and answers.
Yeah, before we get to the question and answer, I'll just give a brief summary of what we've covered today. Mike's presented a lot of great content for us regarding the phone interview, and probably the single most important point to remember regarding the phone interview is that its purpose is to obtain the next level, which is a face-to-face interview. So not to use a cliche, but during a phone interview, you want to keep your eyes on the prize, and that is a face-to-face interview. So you want to spark that interest while talking to your interviewer and try to move to that next level. It's also important to remember that it's not an interrogation. It's a conversation between two people. And if you view it like that, you'll feel fewer nerves, particularly at the beginning of the call. This person is just as interested in learning about you as you are about learning about the job. So have that conversation, that balance back and forth, and don't be too worried that it's an interrogation. Another very important point is preparation, and we covered this in pretty great detail during the presentation, but this is also a good key to your feeling that comfort, you're feeling that relaxation, or you're feeling that lack of nerves. If you're prepared, if you've practiced and you know what to say, you have an idea of what they may be asking, and you're familiar with the position and the qualifications needed for that position, you'll feel much more comfortable because you won't feel caught off guard by any questions. You'll be able to anticipate the type of question that they're going to ask, and you'll be prepared to answer that in full. Also, you want to be sure at the end of your interview to ask about the next step. You don't want to be too pushy here because they need time to consider your conversation as well, maybe talk to their manager, talk to the recruiter, etc. But you want to make sure that you express your interest in the job. And by express the interest, you want to say that you have interest, but you also want to give them just a very short sentence or two recap of why you would be a good fit for their position, why it would be in their best interest to hire you, and how you would fit into their company culture and their position. So make sure to express that interest verbally on the phone. And then finally, following up is very important, particularly when you don't have that face-to-face. You want to be sure that you've put yourself in front of them again as a reminder of everything that you had discussed. It's similar to the expression of interest verbally, but you want to just put that in a very short email form afterward. And you can follow the best practices that Mike detailed about how and when to follow up. And if you follow these tips and tactics for your phone interview, you will have much greater success and less nerves and in obtaining that face-to-face interview, which is an important part of the job seeking process. And on that note, we will move to the live question and answer. To ask a question, just use the toolbar on the right-hand side of the page. You can expand it using that orange arrow and then go down to the comment and question box that you've been using throughout the webinar, and we will answer them as they come in. Okay, wow, we have a lot of questions already. So the first one is from Casey, who asks, how do I get the interviewer's email if a recruiter set up the interview? Mike, you want to take that one?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One is with the research that you did with the in LinkedIn, and if you didn't do it before the interview, certainly you've got the interviewer's name after the interview. You can go to LinkedIn, and many people on their LinkedIn profiles do have an email address. And certainly if you don't have an email address or aren't able to get it, you could also do the non-generic request to connect with the individual and have a very short thank you note with that invitation to connect on LinkedIn. That's not what I would really recommend because you don't get a lot of characters in that intro to connect on LinkedIn, but that's certainly one way that you could do it if you can't get the email address other ways. Certainly if you're on the phone call and you're wrapping up and you don't have an email address of the individual through the process leading up to the phone interview, you could certainly ask the individual, Mary, would it be appropriate for me to follow up by email, and if so, can I have your email address to do that? And you know, most will probably give it at that point. If they don't, then you know, so be it, and just drive on. And another way that you can do it would then be to call the main line of the company and their location where you're at or where that person was at, if hopefully you were able to ascertain that. And then you could get the receptionist on the phone, and though they won't always give it to you, oftentimes that person will give you the email if you call it and explain that you're attempting to follow up with Mary Jones, and could you please confirm the email address for Mary? Those would be some of the quick ways that you could potentially find an email address if you don't have it.
Thanks, Mike. And Jeff asks, will you post the slides or email this presentation out after for later viewing? And Jeff, the answer to that is yes. Both the recording and the slides will be included in the follow-up email, which will be sent out in the next day or so. Kathleen asks, how do you address salary if it was not disclosed in the position you applied for? Mike, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, Kathleen, in the at this phase, in the phone interview phase, there's two different ways of approaching this. One is if they don't bring up salary in the phone interview, and a lot of people won't at this phase because it's considered an early phase in the evaluation process, excuse me, then don't ask or press that issue in the phone interview phase. It's really premature to get to that point in the phone interview, because at this phase in the game, when you're in your job search process, the phone interview, your mindset should be all about what I can do for the company, and only about 5% what can the company do for me. You don't want to start thinking about yourself until you're in person and you're on the verge of getting an offer. You want to keep your focus on what am I going to deliver and bring to that company that's going to be of value to them and convey that message. So if it's not asked and it's not brought up, I really say don't worry about it in the phone interview phase. You'll get there. If they do ask the question of you, what's your salary expectations while or in looking at this position, and you just don't know it, then what you want to make sure you do is that you understand what our potential, what's the potential salary range for this position. And one way you can do a little bit of research to understand that would be to utilize a website called salary.com, and you can go in there and search by position type and zip code even, and it will give you average salaries for position types in any area in the country. And they do a pretty fair job at it and have effective data in there that you can use then to make sure that in this very early phase of the interview process, you don't price yourself out of the job by giving a super high number without having all the information yet about what you're really going to be doing in the role and how you should really be compensated for that. Again, it's pretty early, so a lot of times you won't get this early at this phase. But again, if you do, do some research. It's good to be prepared for this question, and I encourage everyone to have that research done before you go into the interview so you can know a general range at least of what people are receiving in the area for similar types of positions that you're interviewing for.
Jeremy asks a great question. He asks, does it make sense to print the job listing and highlight specific terminology from that job description and use those keywords in the interview, or is it too generic or common to do so?
Jeremy, my quick answer is yes. This is where that practice comes into play, in that that's actually great preparation. You're bringing up a super point, in that you want your answers to portray to the interviewer that you understand or at least have knowledge of what it is that they need and want in that position. And so you're going to show that you've prepared, and it's not cliche or it's not just using buzzwords to do that. It's actually part of what I would call the listening process, and you're working to fill a need. And as long as you do that naturally and weave those things into your personal story, it won't come across as contrived. It will just come across as prepared.
James asks, how do I explain a lapse in work? My personal example is that I had surgery that went wrong and turned into 8 surgeries over a 4-year period. During that time, I finished my degree and was self-employed, but this is a big question that comes up in phone interviews. How do I handle this?
I see that as a great opportunity to tell a story of overcoming adversity, and in doing it, finding the positives in life to continue forward. I think you can weave a great story in that, and you've got nothing to be ashamed of with that type of a gap. Everybody has ups and downs in life, and your reality that you've got there is that you were hit with a pretty serious health issue that didn't allow you to fully commit 100% of your time to an employer. And so because of that, you did what you had to do, and you worked to improve yourself and furthered your education and essentially weathered the storm, and are now ready, after having healed and having taken care of the health situation, are fully ready and able to move forward. But I think you weave in the overcoming of adversity and it being a result of health issues. And frankly, if an interviewer would ding you for that, then you don't want to work for that employer anyway. And there are cultures that would ding you for that because they're that's just the way they are. And again, if a culture would ding you, or an individual would give you black marks for having such a serious health issue that took you a long time to work through, you don't want to work for them anyway. You just need to hone your story to be about overcoming adversity and being persistent and finding the positive and improving yourself and driving forward in all the face of that adversity.
Perry has a good question. He asks, is it appropriate to ask the interview when the position will close? I asked this in an effort to schedule the follow-up thank you letters.
It's certainly appropriate to ask an interviewer what's the time frame that they have in their hopes of having the new person on board for this position. So that's a perfectly acceptable question to ask in your questions that you would ask in this conversation.
James asks, should gaps in employment be accounted for on the resume?
James, it's hard to know specifically without knowing fully the personal story. And gaps can be anywhere from 1 month to 2 years. A lot of it depends on what was going on during that gap. and why was there a gap. We just heard the adversity that I believe it was Jane had, and how she had to work through that. That's a gap that would be one that, again, the majority of people would get and understand. So it's more about what did you do in that gap than the fact that you had a gap. You don't want to come across as someone that was just sitting on their hands and waiting for something to happen. But hopefully you're able to share a story of moving forward, being involved in the community, doing things to improve yourself, and those types of things. And specifically addressing it on your resume, if you have gaps, you have them. And so they are what they are. You can't recreate your personal history. And again, there will be some companies that won't like that, and you just have to accept that. And others will be willing to further the conversation and get to know you as an individual. And you have to come to those personal grips that that's the company that you want to potentially be with anyway, not the one who's going to think that your gap is a bad thing. So it is sometimes going to take you a little bit longer, because you're going to have to work through that with some employers for sure.
And that's going to wrap up our question and answer session. If you think of any more questions or have any follow-up questions afterward, please feel free to email us directly. Our email addresses will be available on the follow-up email. We also encourage you to visit our website at www.recruitmilitary.com. We have a lot of other job-seeking resources and opportunities there for you. We also have other webinars on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to view those as well. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/recruitmilitary, and we cover all kinds of topics from resume writing to cover letter writing to how to work a job fair effectively. We will be sending out a recording of this presentation to you in the next day or two, and we thank you for joining us today. And Mike, thank you for presenting all this great information.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everybody for joining us. And we hope that you're able to go out and be successful in your job search.